Hello, Nat.
Yes, sorry.
Hello, Natalie. It's Adele. How are you?
Yes, Adele. I'm good, and you?
I'm very well, thank you. I just want to check in with you, Natalie, that the exams for this module is the 9th of November. It starts.
I don't know, Adele. Maybe the students can help us.
Yes, I think Lizzie confirmed that. I just want to make sure the other students also understand it as such.
Okay.
9th of November, which means your classes will then end before the 9th for IOP1601.
Okay.
And I just also want to make it clear that they are not allowed to contact you for assistance with the exam paper between the 9th and the 13th of November. Because the exam starts on the 9th and it ends on the 13th.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I get you.
To make it clear that no one-on-ones will be allowed during that time and no additional sessions because they are in a summative period.
Yes.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Perfect. That's all I wanted to say. And then there's a new feedback form for tonight. So please, can you also just remind the students before the end of your session just to complete that feedback form, okay?
Sure.
Thank you, Natalie.
Okay, so it then means that the last session we will have will be on the 1601, will be on 4 November. If your exam is on the 9th. Yeah, so it would be 4 November. Let me just check back into the chat. Okay. Welcome to all the other people who have joined us. This is IOP 1601. I am Natalie Engelbrecht and I'm the facilitator for this module. And tonight in this module, we discuss personality at large. And tonight we're going to just take a bit of a deep dive into the trait theory as it relates to personality. And it has become quite commonplace to describe or characterize people according to particular traits. And what is a trait? A trait is a specific attribute to describe and explain ways of behaving, ways of thinking, ways of feeling and doing. Those components all make up a trait. So it's how you behave, how you think, how you feel, and what you do. Those elements together make up a trait. So people are being classified or characterized according to the traits, the factors, or the dimensions to explain those enduring characteristics of personality and behavior, thought, and feelings. The trait approach in psychology is probably the most used and influential approach in the study of personality and individual differences, because we all have very different traits. We all behave in different ways. We all feel a myriad of feelings across the spectrum. And tonight we're just going to look at, are there traits that can be applied to everybody? And are there traits that are very individualistic? And I think you can already point to the answer. It is a combination of both. And sometimes the theorist, when they look at that aspect, it becomes very confusing. Is it the one or is it the other? Are we all the same or are we all completely uniquely different? And I think the thing that you need to take away from trait theory is that there are pockets where we are all the same, but the degree of the presence of that trait is different. And then there are areas or traits that's very specific to an individual, because things like your biology, hereditary factors, your social external environment, and internal states also contribute to those traits within the individual. So trait psychology really helps with understanding of individual differences between individuals and groups, which is very important for assessment and other applications in all psychological practice areas, especially in personnel management, organizational psychology, consumer behavior, and counseling psychology. So it really tries and give us, an understanding of those individual differences and the ability to test whether some of these traits that are being described in some of the assessment tools later on, how that shows up, whether they get a low score or whether they get a high score, and then what does it say about a person's personality, especially as it relates to the work context. Because why do we do these things? We want to make sure that we are assessing people that close as possible resembles those attributes and traits that will make them successful in the role that we are recruiting for. And trait theory played a very huge part in what we now in 2020 understand of what makes up personality and how we can assess for those, and how the insight of this trait theory and personality can help us to make good, solid decisions going forward. So the trait or factor, sometimes it's called the factor theory, sometimes the trait theory, it's the same thing. It explains and predicts personality along distinctive traits or personality characteristics that can be more or less consistent across time and situations. So we've already seen, however, in our previous weeks, how personality does change through things like maturity and the context in which somebody operates. Trait concepts refer to differences amongst people, indicating characteristic internal dispositions and observable behaviors, feelings which development and psychological adjustment. If you could just mute your microphones. I think somebody's microphone is on. And you're welcome to switch them back on if you have a comment or a question, please. And I think one of the important things that trait psychologist acknowledges that all people possess varying degrees of inherited and acquired personality traits. So it is a double approach. Yes, inherited, but some also acquired simply because of my environment and the people I surround myself with and how that impacts personality. So traits can be measured, and tonight we're going to look at 3 types of tests that measures traits. We're going to look at the 3-factor theory, we're going to look at the 16PF and the 5-factor theory, and how all of those theories work together to present to us today a good model of assessment information that we can use to either appoint people, to promote people, assessment in the clinical context. So a lot of applications for some of these assessment tools. And you will see there's a lot of repetition throughout this chapter. And I think it's a good thing because it just cements again your workable understanding of what are some of the main trait assumptions, as an example. So trait theories assume that personality consists of particular traits that people have that are more or less enduring characteristics across time and situation, and that these traits direct and organize behavior and provide each individual with a fairly identifiable personality profile. I mean, if you're standing around the braai and a family member walks in and you want to introduce that person to the group that you are standing with, you will say, "This is John. He's a very jovial guy. He loves to fish and he loves helping people. And the way that he carries himself is with confidence, etc., etc." So how do people make those determinations? How do people make those observations? Because they know the person, they live with the person, they've observed the person in different situations, and therefore have a lasting impression of what makes up the characteristics of this person. And it's also said that people often seem to remain more or less the same in respect of their basic personality characteristics and ways of doing things. So yes, maturation does come in, but you won't move million miles apart from what is recognized as your basic personality characteristics. A person's traits might also be quite observable in behavior, although many assert that aspects of people's behavior might be attributable to unconscious causes. So you will remember when we talk about Freud's theory, we talk about the unconscious and the subconscious. So sometimes we're not even aware of some of those things. And that is because of biology, sometimes, or because of hereditary factors. Let's look at personality defined as traits. So we did say that traits are tendencies or predisposition that people have to act, think, and feel in particular ways. So it's either that you can have somebody that has a very short fuse, so the person doesn't have a lot of patience, and something like that is quite prevailing throughout your life. You might mellow a little bit with maturation, but overall, you will remain somebody who has a short fuse. People who have similar traits might also behave similarly. One of the theorists is Alport, and he defined personality as the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine his characteristics, behavior, and thought. Now, people who talk about somebody's character, and when you talk about somebody's character, you talk about those traits that you see in the person, be that positive or sometimes negative traits. Alport's definition is quite complex and complete. It recognizes that personality is determined by the interaction of biological and psychological processes. and we've already learned about this in this module. Personality is an organized whole consisting of interdependent physical, cognitive, and psychosocial aspects. So it's not just one thing. It's a combination of physical, cognitive, and psychosocial. Personality is very much dynamic in that it develops and grows and changes as the individual matures and learns. Last week, we spoke about learning. Wait. I get so confused with the various modules. Yeah, personality by learning was chapter 15 and how that influences personality. Changes or variations in how personality is expressed can also occur from time to time or across situations. Sometimes you find yourself in a difficult situation, and then you might act slightly differently than in a situation where there is no threat. There's no threat to your safety, no threat to your self-esteem, and you will act differently across those two situations. So that is why it is situational as well. Personality through the psychophysical system, motives, and direct behavior. Personality provides recognizable or characteristic, unique attributes, thoughts, and behavior which enable the individual to adapt in his/her environment. And Alport says that traits are psychophysical system that exists, that gives structure to personality, and it directs and motivates behavior. Traits, especially as a result of underlying neurological processes, provide stability to behavior and personality. And I think that's quite important. What does stability mean? And what is the effect of neurological processes on the stability of behavior and personality? And we know that in the clinical sense, that would most probably result in some kind of clinical diagnosis. Now, one of the other theorists, Cartel, defines personality as behavior in specific situation, refers to traits as the building blocks of personality, which must provide personality with characteristics, consistent behavior to allow others to know what to expect of someone. So you can see it's a little bit different from the guy before, but also very much around the same lines. Cartel recognizes that personality expressed in behavioral traits is a function of people and all the attributes in interaction with their environment. Let's look at traits. What is the definition of traits? Trait descriptions of personality uses specific attributes to describe and explain characteristic ways of behaving, thinking, feeling, and doing. We've already said that. Traits are inherited and represent learned potential or predispositions, which direct and motivate behavior and which give structure to personality or those attributes that make up personality. So there's the inherited part that also forms part of, there's the learning part that forms part of that traits that make up personality. And a combination of traits can lead to a profile, a type or style description. So you know that when you go for psychometric assessment, and it is a personality assessment. You will get a report at the end of the day that gives a profile of who you are in terms of their characteristics that make up your personality, which are strong and which are weaker, and that profile will give you that insight. Now let's look at one of the factors, one of the assessments, that is the three-factor theory. So the three-factor theory was developed and it was successful in infiltrating the public mindset with regards to how we think about personality in day-to-day life. Using factor analysis to devise the theory, this psychologist, Eysenck, identified three factors of personality: extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Now, he says if the one is present, then the polar opposite would also be present. And that's why he measures extroversion versus introversion, neuroticism versus emotional stability, and psychoticism versus self-control. So you can't be both. One of those opposites would be dominant. So yes, you sometimes might act in an introverted manner, but most of the time you are an extrovert in terms of how you are made up together. Introverts get their energy from within, whereas extroverts get their energy from their external environment. So introverts will sit in a corner alone in a library, lost in a book for hours, and will be happily sitting there. Whereas an extrovert might look at that situation and be very bored because it's too quiet and there's no other people around that they can get their energy from. And so it is the same for the others as well. So that's the three-factor theory explained. And then there's a number of other elements that sits below the extrovert, introvert. There's questions that sits below that then at the end of the day gives a profile of where on this spectrum that you sit. So you would either be extrovert, introvert, either on the neurotic side or the emotional stability side. And I think in this aspect, when he talks about psychoticism, this is not in the clinical sense. It rather refers to antisocial behavior, because that would be antisocial behavior versus self-control. And it's not a reference to the mental illness in the way he uses it. So that was three-factor theory. I think you will understand this. It is not very difficult. And the next one, none of these are really difficult. You just need to kind of remember what goes where. But three factors already say it. It's those three factors, and if the one is present, the polar opposite is present, but you will always have strength in one above the other, and that would describe your personality. Now, personality has 16 personality factors. So there's a questionnaire, and you can go onto the internet actually and find some of these free 16 PF questionnaires and complete it, and you can even assess it yourself. They give you a little assessment guide, and at the end of the day, it kind of gives you insight into your personality because of going through those 16 factors. Now, the 16PF provides insight into, because it measures normal personality. It is used by psychologists, by mental health professionals, and it's a clinical instrument to help diagnose psychiatric disorders and help with prognosis and therapy planning. So it is a widely applied questionnaire. It's been used, I think this questionnaire is probably 40 years old. But it is still being used up to today. And of course, over the 40 years, they've made a number of changes as new insight and information comes about. And I think the things that it gives insight to, such as an individual's capacity for insight, self-esteem, cognitive style, internalization of standards, openness to change, somebody's capacity for empathy, your level of interpersonal trust, your quality of attachments, interpersonal needs, attitudes towards authority. It's a very important one for the workplace. Reactions towards dynamics of power, again important for the workplace. Frustration, tolerance, and coping styles. So there's a lot of these elements that can be applied, luckily, to many applications and not just to the workplace. But I think industrial and organizational psychologists finds this instrument to be indicative of somebody's personality and can be applied to make decisions, especially when it comes to talent acquisition. In your textbook, I think this is page 356. It gives a table 16.2. It gives you a view of what those 16 factors are. And it's things like warmth, mental alertness, emotionality, dominance, liveliness, conformity, boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractedness, privateness, apprehension, change orientation, self-discipline, perfectionism, tension. So those are the 16 factors. And if you score low, there's a meaning attached to it. If you score high, there's a meaning attached to it. So let's take one example. If the factor to be assessed is warmth, depending on how you responded and you get a low score, it means you are reserved. And if you get a high score, it means that you are outgoing. So those are the 16 PF questionnaire. Very, very useful tool. And I think the 16PF was probably the model, more so than your 3-factor and your 5-factor model, that has led to some of the more later personality assessment tools, like the OPQ, Occupationally Directed Questionnaire, and some of the others that have been developed. And I think 16PF was a trailblazer in bringing about what some of the instruments that we use today. So if we look at the personality as 5 factors, this model also enjoys wide acceptance. The traits have been proved to have construct and predictive validity, and good theoretical descriptions support the various trait descriptions. This theory represents a new integrative way of describing, assessing, and studying personality and its relationship to many other contexts. Concepts in the five-factor model represent psychological knowledge from many personality theories and decades of personality and other psychological research. And I think that's an important point. It has been extensively researched, and it has considered some of the personality theories from various theorists that works in the area of personality. And all that information was brought together in this one model. Each of the five factors is described by specific traits which represent a finer analysis of personality, much like the 16PF that we just spoke about. While the five-factor model does well in describing personality, but not as well in explaining behavior, especially underlying causes, internal personality dynamics, and underlying motivation. Now, this is what the five factors look like. It measures across conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. And you can see there are the things on the positive side and on the not so positive side, what it measures. So it does, in terms of how the constructs have been put together, it does give you a very good insight. A quite dependable insight in terms of your personality. Right. Let's look at types and styles. The concept of traits, types, and styles are similar, in that they denote a person's disposition to act in a specific way if she has a certain traits. For example, they may act in an introverted or extroverted way. Some would say, however, that one cannot be both introverted and extroverted. Type and style concepts are used less frequently than trait concepts. So the focus is really on trait concepts and the work that has been done in that area. Now, the various trait models use trait concepts, the building blocks of personality, to explain various aspects of personality, such as structure, motivation, development, and adjustment. Traits not only describe personality, but also specific aspects of personality, such as values, your interest, motives, attitudes, and abilities. And I think the next statement is very telling. Alport's famous statement that in some respects, all people are alike. In some respects, some people are similar. And in some respects, every individual is unique. I think this summarizes trait theory's view on trait type. And I hope that makes sense to you, because it is all-encompassing concept. Yes, there are elements in trait theory that is similar for all people. There are traits that are very different across some people. And then there are some that is just unique to an individual. So it is an and situation. It's not one thing. It is a combination of. Let's look at general traits in most people. According to Cattell and Alport, some traits are shared by most people in varying degrees. To Alport, common traits are the measurable, structural, and motivational units of personality, which are general or common to most people within a given culture. People may have common traits such as being aggressive, but their aggressiveness differs in quantity and quality. I mean, if you just think of some families that you know, sometimes as a family, they could have a common trait such as they like to fight, you know. So when they are at a party and they belong to that same family and they had maybe too much to drink, then the first blow would normally come from somebody in that family. And I think that is when people have common traits, such as being aggressive. And it just depends on the situation, which will let that aggressiveness come out or suppress it. Now, Alport and Cattell view traits such as neuroticism, ambitiousness, friendliness, and so forth as common traits that all people, as a result of similarities in hereditary potential and learning, possess to a lesser or greater extent. So it goes back to the statement that says, in some respects, all people are alike. In some respects, some people are similar. And in some respects, every individual is unique. Let's look at traits in personality development. In contrast to Freud, Alport and Cattell do not believe that the adult personality is totally as a result of what happens to a person during childhood. They discount the influence of unconscious factors. So this one, again, a little bit of a different approach. The one we just did before this said the unconscious is also at play, and here they say, nope, it's not being influenced. Instead, they believe that individuals are free to develop their personalities according to their own motivation and goals. Alport believed that positive psychological growth into a mature adult can only be achieved if positive conditions and a healthy biological makeup are present during the gradual development of the person's potential. I want to stop here for a moment and just ask a question in the group. When you read that statement, is this something that you agree with or do you disagree?
I don't think I agree with it 100%. I feel like there's a lot of people that have very unfavorable situations and very weird biological makeup, and they still turn out pretty fine psychologically.
100%. Absolutely. And there is no deficit in their personality per se because of an upbringing or social conditions or biological makeup even. So interesting point. Thank you. dynamics, motivation. Dynamics refers to processes and factors in the motivation, change, and adjustment of personality. So when does personality change? How does that happen? What are those influences that can cause that? In the trait approaches, trait concepts are also used to explain behavior motivation. Extremely high or extremely low scores on a trait scale mean that in a specific situation, the person's behavior manifests with a certain magnitude, or that intrinsically the person possesses a strong or less strong trait. So I think that just says, that depending on the situation, you might get an explosion from somebody that's on the Richter scale of a 6.2 magnitude. But again, in a different context, it might be a magnitude of 1.5 as an example. And you saw earlier when we spoke about the 16 PF, what a low score means and what a high score means. Because that will then be a predictor of when that magnitude will come out. Cattell asserts that temperament and ability traits, which include intelligence, determines how much and how efficiently people will work in order to make progress towards their goals and be successful in their work. So temperament and ability, also very important. He believed that people's general intelligence is largely inherited and termed it fluid general intelligence. Again, that would be an interesting discussion point, about intelligence. Is it largely inherited? And I think the answer is probably yes and no. It is both. Because we also looked at the whole concept of nature versus nurture, and that would also play a role here. Learned or crystallized general ability is acquired in learning processes and is not genetically influenced. Let's look at psychological adjustment. Trait approaches do not postulate a specific theory or concept to explain psychological maladjustment. Most theorists are interested in the healthy, mature personality. They emphasize how personality traits develop as a result of the interplay between genetic or biological factors as well as influences in the environment, and how these traits give rise to the type of behavior that can be classified as either adjusted or maladjusted. In general, traits as measured by some self-reporting techniques such as the 16 PF questionnaire are used to explain adjustment or maladjustment, particularly with regard to personality disorders and other psychological disorders. With regard to psychological health, Alport emphasizes the mature adult personality as independent from possible childhood problems. And this is why it is different from Freud. Freud said psychoanalysis, if you go back to childhood and you identify some trauma in childhood, and explain why the person is behaving in a particular way now. That behavior now is as a result of childhood trauma. However, the quality of adult maturity is dependent on how the self has developed in all its stages during childhood towards maturity and the attainment of life goals. So the self is important, and whether you have set goals for yourself and whether you have a direction that you are following, maturity depends on that. Maturity cannot happen unless those things have been looked at. If you are goalless, if you don't know where you're going, if you don't have dreams and vision for your life, etc. If the self-development is insufficient, aggressive, unreliable, and demanding, the adult personality can follow suit. In Alport's term, the self cannot become functionally autonomous, because that is what is required for a solid personality. This means that behavior traits are not sufficiently organized, integrated, and consistent to give the adult the competence and mastery to manifest appropriate coping behaviors in life situations, and that life goals for a meaningful life will be frustrated. So it is important that those behavioral traits find identification in the self-image, in the setting of goals, in how you cope in life situations. Is personality consistent, or does it change over time? And by what percentage could it potentially change? Now, the accepted definition of personality traits as enduring patterns of behavior in people across situations and time also indicate that personality traits are a constituent across the agreement amongst trait approaches that traits provide stability and consistency to personality in people across time, situations, culture, which make predictions and comparisons of behavior possible. In most cases, the trait approaches also tend to align this consistency with hereditary or biological factors as a basis for assessment and prediction of behavior. The controversial issue is whether traits are in fact consistent indicators of personality, especially amid some findings that personality measurements are not the best predictors of actual behavior. This means that success or failure in work performance is also attributable to influences other than personality. This is in contrast to measurement of cognitive or ability factors, which generally have high predictive powers for job success and training success criteria. How consistent is personality? And I think we already said, that yes, there is a biological factor, there's a hereditary factor, and there's also a situational factor. So another explanation for the level of consistency in personality measurement is called situationism, which means that the situation in which a person operates influences the person more than personality itself. A fundamental mistake in situationism is the underemphasis on the human factor in situations. In fact, behavior in most situations is influenced more by a person's perception of the situation than by the situation itself. And we know that perception is formed by looking through the lens of what is your internal makeup, what is your current context, what is your socio-cultural environment. In looking at the situation influences your behavior and not the situation itself. It's how you perceive that situation as either threatening or welcoming, and that will impact your behavior. So do people read situations in a particular way? Is there a right or wrong way to read a situation, therefore have a perception of the situation? That's a debatable point. In this regard, a cognitive view of stress is that a stressor, for instance, work overload, will cause stress reactions only once the employee perceives him or herself as not being able to cope with the demands of the work. So there can be two people sitting next to each other. They each receive 100 files that they have to work through the day. One person is just heads down and get on with it, but the other person look at these 100 files and get that perception that this is a lot of work. My historical information says that 100 files mean I actually need 3 days and not 1 day in which to complete it, and that brings about anxiety. So the way they will respond and behave in that situation is different, where somebody else looks at the same situation and just in their stride, just get on with things. Consistency from person-situation interaction. A third approach to explaining the consistency of personality is interactionism, where consistency of personality or human behavior is studied through a consideration of the effect, the situation, and the behavior. So this is a more encompassing approach. Interactionism states that personality, the situation, and the resultant behaviors in collaboration contribute to the personality consistency, and both should be taken into account in behavior prediction. Small changes in a situation, such as waiting long to be served in a restaurant, might also influence personality expression and behavior in people. Such people will probably behave in the same way in another similar situation, because there is a belief that sits behind that behavior. And that belief could be something like, I hate to wait. I don't like waiting, whether that is waiting for my food, waiting in a line behind a checkout counter. I don't like waiting. This principle of interactionism is important in human resource development whenever one wants to place people in situations with or without other people to perform certain tasks. So I think what it says is, be careful how you group people together to do certain tasks or to work together on a project, because you want to assure that people stay on task and you want to ensure that people working on a project together support each other. So it is important to have this kind of insight into personalities. Why? Because we do know that personalities clash. Some personalities, when it comes in contact with similar personalities, just simply don't mix. It's an oil and water situation. So it is important that you pair people to work on certain projects where you know that that interpersonal relationship is sound. It doesn't mean that there will never be an explosion or differences of opinion, but people will at least have the maturity to be able to exist and thrive in that situation versus completely shut down and unable to perform at all. In conclusion, personality traits and related concepts such as types and styles are abstract concepts for the more enduring, real, or underlying behavior and patterns of behavior in people with regard to personality structure, motivation, development, and psychological adjustment. Because I think when you have a cemented personality, you are able to adjust in various situations, depending on what you are presented with. Although traits refer to dimensions of personality and can never tell all about personality, integrated views such as outputs and trait models such as the 3-factor, the 5-factor model, and the 16 personality factor models go some way to explain personality structure, describing personality as an integrated whole, and making provision for the uniqueness in each person. And I think that is an important one for me. The development of traits might have genetic sources. They are shaped and influenced by situations and how people behave in situations. With regard to motivation, certain traits also energize behavior in a certain direction. For example, Alport's trait concept of functional autonomy refers to adult motivation that has grown independently from previous motives. Psychological maladjustment in people refers to the manifestation of exaggerated traits, while psychological health refers to the development of maturity, which includes attainment of life goals, functional autonomy, and the manifestation of healthy traits. Those healthy traits determine optimal functioning and behavior. Psychological assessment and prediction, according to the trait approach, are both based on the premise that all people have more or less of certain general and unique traits, and that traits are quite consistent in people and across time and situations. Now that is what I wanted to discuss with you tonight. Can I have your views, please? Let me hear from you. what you have learned tonight in this session about trait theory. It doesn't have to be a mouthful. Now that we have come to the end of the session, what are your takeaways from trait theory? You remember last week I also asked that people read this chapter before the time. I hope you all had time for that. I know time is a scarce commodity these days. But what is your takeaway from this discussion today? Mildred, what do you say?
Okay, I would say takeaway from me is that personality does not depend on one factor, like the giving example of maybe the psychodynamic theories, because it's actually dependent on a variety of aspects. I would say maybe cognitive, situational, and relationships. So from me, I think this trait theory is actually a theory that actually best describes personality.
Thank you so much, Mildred. Megan. Megan, anything you want to add to the discussion? What is your takeaway of tonight? Okay, sorry, Megan has lost her voice. Anna, what is your takeaway from tonight? Let me jump to Justine.
Sorry, I'm here. My phone freaked out quickly. I find this trait theory super interesting. I think you pronounce it I-sync, with the three-factor trait theory.
Yes.
I thought it was really interesting how they describe it as having bipolar dimensions.
Yes.
I just thought that was really interesting, and I love that we have so many different ways and so many different theorists that have contributed to this to give us this holistic view of traits. So I've just really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Janine. Lizzie, how about you?
Hi everyone.
Hey.
Thank you for what do you call it? For shining the spotlight on us. That's a nervous laugh. I'll say like what Jessica, I think it's Jessica, like what she said. From
Justine.
Justine, yes. It is an interesting topic. And it's also just interesting from my side, just listening to all the assumptions which are listed when it comes to the trait theory on its own, and like all the aspects which affect traits, whether it's genetics, learning, culture, or whatever situational experiences that you face in a day-to-day. So for me, it's just eye-opening. It's supposed to be stuff which we know, but it's always interesting when you read how other people, like how they interpret it, and tie it back to psychology. So I still have to go through the work again just to sort of gather my thoughts.
Sure. No, thanks, Lizzie. Claudia, how about you? What is your takeaway? Okay, it might be a little bit too intimidating. I'm sorry, guys, for putting you on the spot, but I think you all gave such good insight into having gone through the content of this chapter. And I think it will just help you in the exams, you know, as you go through internalizing and understanding this, because your exam is going to be multiple choice questions. I think trait theory, because it is such an important component of psychology, especially as it pertains to the formation of personality, is something that I think has a high probability of, you know, being one or two questions asked about that. So thank you very much for your time. If there's nothing else further, I'm going to say bye-bye, have a good evening, and I shall see you again next week. Please, Adele has put a link in the chat for your feedback. If you could please take a couple of minutes and just complete the feedback for her. Everybody that joined, have you put your student number in the chat? I'm trying to see. Claudia did, Lizzie did, Justine did, Mildred did. Yeah. So if there's nothing further, I shall see you next week, same time. And for next week, if you will be so kind and try to read chapter 17 for us. And chapter 17 is personality through self-experiences. And it goes a lot into the humanistic approach to psychology. So chapter 17 is what we will talk about next week. Thank you, ladies. Have a good evening further.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, ladies. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cool. Thank you so much. Bye.